Okay, welcome back to week 10 of Living Wisdom Online. Just another great week, and looking forward to this is our last week. So I'll share a couple of thoughts around that at the end of our broadcast. A couple of technical difficulties we've run into again, but anyway, so you may not be able to see this live, but anyway, you will be able to catch up with the recording later on. So we're looking at family mottos. We're also going to be doing a bit of a recap around the fusions as well. As I said, it's pretty hard to believe, week 10. Thanks so much for those who've contributed to our community. Your contribution has been noticed and appreciated. Make sure you please fill out the survey. We've had 4 who have filled out the survey so far. We really want to get this feedback to inform our next steps. And there have been a couple of minor issues with the link there, but that's now sorted out as well. And so you just need to go and click on that link. And I also appreciate those who've left their details as far as providing further feedback about Living Wisdom Mindset. So, yeah, so leave your details and you might be surprised over the next couple of weeks you'll be hearing from me. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to Dave very shortly, and we're just going to start off by Dave giving us a bit of a summary around family mottos and also looking at the whole area of fusions. There's been a lot of activity this week around family mottos, so clearly we've really struck a chord. And Dave, I'm going to hand to you now. So here's Dave.
Yeah, thanks very much, Darren. In Living Wisdom, we're very concerned to reprogram the subconscious so that it's not all about volition, cognitive, try harder, self-discipline, willpower. And a vital part of restructuring the subconscious is to consider our formative factors. Formative factors can be childhood experiences, can be childhood trauma, can be very early experiences and life-defining moments. They can certainly also include family mottos. And by family mottos, I mean the waste not, want not sort of things that are said around the table. There are starving children in Biafra. If I have to stop this car, there's going to be trouble. Penny wise, pounds foolish. It goes on and on. And those are the cognitive family mottos. They're the common things that are said by mum and dad, and the kids grow up with them. Perhaps the more insidious ones are the ones that are never spoken. You maybe haven't ever heard a family motto regarding, I don't know, affection or nudity or church or paying tithes, the Bible. What's the family motto regarding keeping pets? I know if you're off a farm, you know how important it is to close the gate and leave the gates as you find them. And that was one of our family mottos. And there was big trouble for someone who disobeyed that family motto about keeping the gates shut. But what about the family mottos regarding, I don't know, screen time, or tall poppies, or confident people, or skiting? What about self-promotion or hugs? You know, in our family, it was never spoken, but hugs were for train stations and airports and bus stations and not much else. So I bring this up because until those family mottos are revisited and surfaced and externalized, they can go on controlling your life in ways you wouldn't even imagine. They are subtle formative factors that must be addressed if our change is going to be total and permanent rather than half-hearted and wishy-washy. So it is restructuring the subconscious at quite a deep level.
So Dave, you've talked about the herd and the unheard, the seen and the unseen family mottos, and from what you're saying, really the unspoken seem to be particularly powerful. Can you give us a little bit more insight as to how these are formed and how we might track these, particularly when they've been unspoken?
Well, I suggested jokingly to one young person that she get a tattoo. And she just shot straight back, no, tattoos are graffiti and I don't want to graffiti my body. And I thought, I don't know if she ever thought about that, but that sounded to me like a family motto. And I said, have you ever heard anybody say that? And she said, yeah, Mum says that all the time. So she didn't even have to think about her opinion of tattoos. It had already been set up for her by that family motto. On the other hand, family mottos about cosmetics may not be spoken. Dad says, don't paint the lily. Mum says, well, I suppose it's inevitable. So it's any counselling that's serious about change and serious about individuation has to consider those family mottos. Otherwise, individuation, which in layman's terms is really becoming your own person and getting on your own 2 feet, can really be slowed down if those family mottos are working against you. For example, don't answer back. Answering back is impertinent. Answering back is stroppy. Answering back is disrespectful. So how do you develop assertiveness skills if the family motto says that any assertiveness is answering back and therefore disrespectful? So we do have to consider the family of origin before we can completely persuade somebody that what they're telling themselves is actually a lie.
So Dave, I guess it could be that 2 siblings could have a different family motto about the same thing. So for instance, with, could it be that their experience has shaped, so they may be points of agreement, but also points of disagreement?
Absolutely. And so you can get 2 children saying, well, in our family, the youngest one always did the dishes, and the oldest one saying, no way, I did my share of dishes all the way through. So you can get a different perception of that. Dinner table etiquette, who's responsible for cutting the lunches? Do the older ones always have to assume more responsibility than the younger ones? And it'll come back to their perspective to a degree, but generally there's a fair bit of uniformity when you get back together for those family reunions and Christmas dinners and you start delving into family mottos. It's surprising how quickly they can identify what their family motto is. And one thing I do invite parents to do is to ask the children what they think the family motto is, even before the kids have ever left home. Sometimes the parents get a real education as to what's coming through as opposed to what they expected they were teaching.
Okay, so if you've worked through and identified some family mottos that clearly seem to be out of sync with a reality or the way things really work, what's the key to changing these things, turning them around?
The difference between what we say we believe and what we actually believe is quite mind-boggling sometimes. So you get the spoken family motto and the unspoken one in contrary to each other. So, I'm doing this for your good can confuse a child if what's happening is actually abusive. And that really sets them up with a crossed up compass as to what is normal and what is not normal. And that's what this is all about, really. What is normal? And that's where emotional abuse and manipulation can confuse a person as to what is right and what is wrong, even though it feels right. So it could be tidiness. I remember one client saying to me, she said, I try and tidy the bedroom, or I try and tidy the, sorry, computer's just gone on the blink. I try and tidy the bedroom, but I can't finish it. I try and sort my wardrobe or my mess and I can't finish it. She says, what do you think's happening? I said, well, I'm not too sure, but I want you to go home make a start on getting organized and tidying up, and see if you can confront that family motto as it surfaces. So we agreed to that experiment, and I sat by the phone, and sure enough, the call came through. She says, "I've got it." She said, "I've suddenly realized that mum has won." In other words, mum's will ruled the house, and you express conformity by tidying. And she had decided years ago that her mother's will was too strong for her, and she would show her resistance by resisting. And that became a habit. And she could not organize her own house until she surfaced that family motto.
So the family mottos, because it is your family of origin, are formed very early. And is this a part of the power because they are such early memories? And does that have a greater impact on our mind?
Yes, absolutely. It's like the childhood posters that were in our bedroom when we were still children. They're having an effect, and they can scare you, or they can imprint something into you long before you're even aware of them. And sometimes when you go back home as an adult, you see paintings or pictures on the wall that have always been there, but you've never ever taken any notice of them. And sometimes a visitor will point them out to you. "That's an amazing painting." "Oh, is it? Really? I'd never noticed." So that's how the family mottos often work. They're invisible by virtue of familiarity. And that's what makes them so dangerous and so subtle.
Okay, Dave, I've got a couple of questions here. This first one, my mum used to say, "There are no skites in our family, but you'll do until we get one." Can you please comment on how that may have impacted the life of myself and my siblings?
Well, I wouldn't like to jump in too quick. It may not have impacted at all. It depends on how it's heard and how it's interpreted. My mother used to say to me, "You know, you're the one I forgot to drown when I did something good." And I knew, being on a farm, that it's always the runt that gets drowned, the runt of the litter. And so she meant it as a compliment, but I took it as something else. And, you know, children are very good recorders of their experiences, but very poor interpreters. So I would suggest that what it could have done is have a gagging effect on somebody from ever saying, "That was a good job I did," or "I did okay," or "I did well," or "I'm proud of my own achievement," because immediately that motto would come up to haunt. I remember a time when I polished up some pennies and sold them to my brother for a shilling. And the whole family thought that was pretty cunning, and so they started calling me the cunning one. And that's like a family motto. I actually despised my own intelligence for years as the result of it being labeled cunning. And so that's where a family motto can knock you back. It can act like the tall poppy syndrome, or it can propel you forward.
So, Dave, we've kind of covered this, but there's a question. Any practical tips for unearthing unspoken subconscious family mottos, aside from going to see a good counsellor, which, of course, is a great idea?
Well, how did I learn that? Who taught me that? Where did I learn that? My first term at university was a horror because I got this terrible ambivalence about being there. Part of me said, this is a worthy ambition to get a degree. As a 17-year-old boy, part of me said, university is a complete waste of time and life is passing you by while you're holed up in this ivory tower. And I never understood why I failed and bombed out completely in my first year until I went back 10 years later and surfaced my father in one ear saying, university is where we put blokes who are no use on the farm. They're a liability, so we put them in university to get them out of the way. And my mother saying, university is a feather in your cap, whatever that means. And so I had these family mottos go off in my head when I enrolled at university, and they completely undermined my persistence until I asked myself, where did I learn this stuff?
Right. So Dave, can you talk about the family roles and systems and how these play out, like the boss hog and the favored one, as far as family mottos go?
Yeah, well, these are formative factors. And while not family mottos, they are family systems and part of family systems therapy. And it's quite helpful in a genogram to work out where you fit and where others fit. I don't do much of that work because you can get into prescribing what should actually just be a description. But boss hog, the highly favored one, the avoider absconder, the perpetual child, and the black sheep scapegoat, they certainly represent 5 different roles that kids can fit into in a family and will still regress back into that role many, many years later when they go home. And so the one who was the perpetual child at home may have 100 people working for them, but when they go back home, they slot straight back into the role of being the child. Now, very powerful, those roles, and people have to work hard sometimes in their marriage to overcome them. What do you get in a marriage if you get 2 boss hogs marrying each other? What do you get in a marriage if you get a boss hog marrying a perpetual child? What do you get if you get 2 black sheep marrying each other? Harley Davidson tattoo parlor, probably, I don't know. But, you know, those family systems have to be teased out sometimes when a marriage is really struggling, because if you get 2 perpetual victims marrying each other, you can imagine that there's blame shifting in totality.
So, Dave, what about where you've got the family, the siblings are actually still putting pressure on one of the siblings, because it's almost like those roles which were maybe cast by mum and dad, now they've become almost self-fulfilling prophecies, not maybe in the mind of the person who was labeled, but in the mind of the other siblings.
Well, of course, you can act in a different way and you can live down their view of you, but it actually speeds the process up if you just say a few simple little words like, I think you're going to have to reassess me. I think you've frozen me into the past. You need to thaw me out and reassess me. Otherwise, you'll end up in a time warp. I'm just no longer that same person. And that sort of fires a warning shot across their bow, and it says, hey, if we're going to be friends, you're going to have to understand that I'm not that person anymore. Of course, if your actions deny the truth of what you're saying, it's not going to wash, but they will just watch you that little bit closer and reassess you that little bit faster if you give them that little warning speech. You'll need to reassess me. You need to thaw me out. Please don't freeze me into the past.
Great. So we're just going to move on to fusions now, and I don't know whether you want to just give a couple of thoughts about kind of an overview of the fusions, area of fusions.
I've seen 5 clients today. 3 of them, their issues came back to a fusion. And that's how important and how common this tricky little thing is in the troubles of our lives. Fusions create confusion. Fusions mean 2 concepts have not delineated or separated. I think for the biologists, it's binary fission. And I think what we're talking about here is a developmental dynamic that enables people to distinguish by making appropriate distinctions between emotional feelings. And so I keep saying to people, that's only disappointment. It's not despair. Are you still there?
I sure am.
Yeah. that's only disappointment. It's not despair. Don't confuse the two. Or that is frustration. It's not rage. Or that is confidence. It's not arrogance. And emotional intelligence is the ability to make these distinctions, but a person's development always arrests where they've failed to make a necessary distinction. And so sexuality isn't simply lust. Sexuality isn't simply selfishness or using. Politeness is not greasing. And yelling isn't the way to be heard or feel heard. And if the brain stops making these distinctions, it's a bit like the emotional version of not being able to distinguish multiplication from addition or subtraction from division. Arithmetically, you make progress by making those four distinctions. And emotionally, you make progress by distinguishing, I don't know, correction from rejection. Now, children get stuck, and they show their stuckness because trouble breaks out in their lives. And I just free children time and time again from arrested development by locating the particular fusion they're stuck on.
So clearly it's a common form of difficulty and leading to confusion. What do you look for, Dave, in the counselling session when what alerts you to the presence of a fusion?
My own experience, really. I got a nose for it now. It's taken me many years, but if you tell me your issue, I can quickly tell you whether or not I think you've got a fusion. But let's just practice a couple. I mentioned earlier confusing cunning with intelligence. Some people who are very, very intelligent fuse intelligence with rejection. And so they try and cover their braininess. They try and cover their intelligence so that they won't be rejected. And they spend the rest of their life walking with a mental stoop so that they won't stand out. A common one, of course, is disappointment with despair. And the ADHD children have often fused correction with rejection. And probably that's one of the most common ones. There are many adults today who actually don't take any correction whatsoever. And the reason for it is that if you correct them, they feel worthless, they feel useless, they feel ripped to pieces, or they feel told off, or they feel humiliated, because their brain hasn't actually got past correction as rejection or correction as humiliation. So if you know what you're looking for, you can find it fairly quickly. And that list that your students have got, that's got all of the common ones listed down there. Familiarity with what you're looking for means you find it much faster.
Right. So, Dave, what about the actual formation of these fusions? How do they tend to be created?
Everything that we learn in a context, and the context often gets rubbed off on the learning. So if your first speaking engagement, you get humiliated or laughed at, then you confuse public speaking with embarrassment. Sexuality, your first arousal, your first awakening can be in a context of humiliation or fear or embarrassment, so that rubs off on it. So I always look at the introduction, because it's a form of imprinting, and imprinting works by the context rubbing off on the lesson. And you'll often find that when people try to be assertive, they get very anxious because they learned assertiveness in conflict or in anger, and so now they're waiting for the backlash.
Oh, that's fascinating. So just a couple of questions here, Dave. Please talk about fear of commitment and fusing commitment with being trapped.
Yeah, another very common one. And the problem with that one is that is commitment without ownership. Commitment without ownership equals obligation. And obligation drains the enthusiasm out of you and can lead to a feeling of being trapped very, very quickly. So it's very important to try and distinguish commitment from martyrdom, commitment from playing the role of the victim, and commitment from obligation. Otherwise, commitment becomes a very scary word. To me, commitment is the same thing as getting focused. And no success comes without getting focused. But you can't get focused if you keep losing your enthusiasm to a spirit of obligation. So I steer away from obligation, but I steer towards focus. And when I'm focused and I'm enthusiastic, I'm automatically committed. There is no pumping up of that whole deal. That makes sense?
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
So we call that laundering the term. We launder the term commitment, we launder the term homework, we launder the term obedience, we launder the term submission. We take out of it the toxicity that it's got fused with.
Okay, here's another question. Oh, the irony. I do believe my conceptual and my emotional fusions have been welded. I'm speaking about the negative ones, as positive fusions are obviously not a problem.
Good.
Is this indicative of emotion-based reasoning, as there seems to be an emotional component in all the negative fusions I can relate to?
Yeah, very good question. The solution is to understand that there's two different kinds of fusions. There is the conceptual fusion, where a child fuses division with multiplication or addition with subtraction. You can that's a conceptual fusion. You can also fuse things emotionally. So sex equals feeling used, or punctuality feels like under control, under restraint, under constraint. Like tidying feels like obligation. Those are emotional fusions. Whereas a pure conceptual fusion could simply be that the Bible is inspired, therefore it must be inerrant, because God wouldn't make a mistake in the Bible. So that's what we'd call a conceptual fusion. And those conceptual fusions work at a slightly different level. They work at an intellectual and an academic level, rather than at an emotional level. But ultimately, according to the brain, they're the same thing.
Okay.
By the way, you've probably heard of Pavlov's dogs, and ring the bell, make the dog salivate, the food is coming. But that's called classic conditioning. It's not actually the same thing as a fusion. If it were a fusion, the dogs would try to eat the bells.
Now, there's an interesting thought. So the dogs would try to eat the bells.
Yeah. So in Pavlov's dogs, there's an association, but it's not a fusion. In an association, you can still distinguish the two. The bell's going to ring and then the food's going to arrive. But in a fusion, you can't distinguish between the bell and the food.
Okay, I got you. So the salivation is the anticipation versus the fusion, where the actual two are connected.
It means the dog can still distinguish.
Right. So then, based on that, you could weld a concept with an emotion.
No, I don't think so. I'll have to think about that, but I don't think so. I'd say emotion with emotion, or concept with concept. And perhaps there's an overlap there somewhere. I've never looked at it.
So if you had mathematics and then you had fused that with a feeling of being overwhelmed.
I just call that a straight out emotional fusion.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got another question here. I tend to feel inadequate, dumb, unliked, rejected, overlooked, and condemned when there is disapproval, correction, and criticism. I can't remember what childhood experience precipitated this fusion. I have a huge amount of self-doubt. Therefore, I feel stuck and tend to deflect correction and criticism, and just wanting some comment on that.
Truth coaches will do the separating. Truth coaches are the wedge that separate the fusion. And in this case, failure is merely feedback on technique, or this feeling is merely a default mood. It's not a reality, or everybody fails to begin with. Nobody starts out competent. Why should I? Truth coaches are the fastest and most powerful way of bringing to death a default mood or an automatic emotion, as well as distinguishing the world. And those truth coaches can be clumsy or accurate. They can have a sharp blade or a blunt blade.
So one of the things that you've said a couple of times, Dave, is you talked about 90% of your clients being healed through working through their fusions, UBFs, and default moods. Can you give us a little bit more on that?
It's about 70%. The rest need life skills such as budgeting or assertiveness or something like that. But all I'm saying there is that so much of the trouble in humanity and in relationships come back to the big three. The unbearable feeling, the fusion, and the default mood. And I would say that every client needs those areas addressed somewhere in their life. But of course, it can be budgeting advice, or it can be goal setting, or it can be assertiveness skills. But even there, you'll still find that those three, plus the family mottos, which I would put in the same category, will be skulking around behind the scenes there somewhere.
So the strategy, the insight and the strategy leads to the radical change.
Absolutely. And so we need the insights to reprogram our mind, and then we need the strategy to set up a new modus operandi, a new way of doing it, new behavior. And the reason for that is because we both think ourselves into a new way of acting, as well as acting ourselves into a new way of thinking.
So in the community, we've had some posts about attachment. Do you think is an attachment wound a form of fusion?
Yes, it is. Attachment wounds say that abandonment is unsurvivable, or my survival is all up to me. And so they fuse alone to lonely. They fuse alone to abandoned. They fuse their own company to danger, or I am not enough. And that's the fusion that abandonment can produce. And it can leave a person somewhat insecure and with default moods for the rest of their lives. Whenever hurting, they'll withdraw, or they will latch on. And both can be fatal to a marriage. Clinging or withdrawing is the usual response to people who have attachment injuries from childhood.
Well, Dave, that pretty much brings us to the end of our questions. I want to thank you on behalf of the students, because the feedback that I've had around the live coaching sessions is that it's been incredibly positive, and it's really helped the students to get down to the next layer, the next level, and you provided some great detail and some great thoughts through these live coaching sessions. So thank you very much for that. And what I'm going to do now is just go through a couple of admin pieces, and then I'm going to hand it over to you for what is the final word. So,
thank you.
Okay. So just from an admin perspective, I just wanted to acknowledge that it's been a tremendous blessing to know those who have contributed through the forum, and I know a number of people have also been following what's been happening on the forum, and so that's been really cool. I've been greatly encouraged to see the progress of our students, albeit at times I've been aware that that's been difficult and painful. But I have loved watching the community grow over the last 10 weeks, and the way that students have mutually supported one another. And there are already signs of some great counsellors and coaches for the future. So that's really encouraging. Of course, is your own radical change goal. So, you know, we continue to encourage you to pursue that, because as in much of life, we can only really take others as far as we've gone ourselves. So from my perspective, I wish everybody well, and look forward to hearing from you in the future. The community will remain live over the next month or two, and we'll just kind of keep an eye on that. I'll be monitoring that. I won't be inputted as much, but certainly I'll be monitoring that, and we'll just see how that progresses, and I'll keep everyone informed as far as what we do there. But in the future, we are looking to have a Living Wisdom online community that is ongoing. So we're working through some of the technical aspects of that at the moment, but certainly that's going to, I think, be a really powerful form of supporting Living Wisdom online. But of course, as I said earlier, it's been great having Dave's input, both in the teaching level and then through the live coaching calls. And of course, this is Dave's brainchild, and Dave is the originator of Living Wisdom. And so it's been wonderful, Dave, having you right in the very heart of what we're doing here in the online environment. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to you. Thanks, Dave.
Yes, and may I thank you, Darren. You've been a marvellous mediator and tutor for Living Wisdom concepts and principles. I also read your replies, and I also am encouraged and totally in approval of how you put it. And sometimes I've said to my wife, there it is, I couldn't have put it better myself. And that is my highest compliment to anybody. And do we have a date for the new start? Do we have a date for next year's yet, or is that still coming?
Yeah, so what we're doing, we're getting the feedback from the Mindset School, and then once we've got that feedback in through the survey, we'll make a real decision, because one of the ideas is actually, do we continue to provide mindset just as itself, or do we combine the notion of the strategy and the mindset coming together? So that's a bit of a question, but certainly we will be getting back into things early in 2019. As the exact date, we still need to determine.
Well, that's all good, because these are real answers. They are designed for real people in real situations, and we want the rubber to hit the road for every student. We're looking for breakthroughs for every student. And as somebody said to me today, can you guarantee me a breakthrough? And I say, if the truth coaches reach the quality they need to, and the strategy is implemented, I will guarantee you that the future will look far better than the past. And so that's the hope that we have. If you always do what you've always done, guess what? But when you make these changes to your thinking and to your approach and your perspective, well, remember, life is 99% attitude. And when you're telling yourself the truth, your mind becomes your friend. And it's been great to lead a whole bunch of people into that through this media, Darren. I've really enjoyed myself.
Well, Dave, thanks very much, and I'll look forward to catching up soon. And thanks, everybody. I'm going to stop the broadcast now and wish you all the best.
Have a great